The strand of cultured pearl snapped with a delicate whisper at exactly 11:23 p.m. on September 8, 1852, as Isabella Vrenneth's final breath escaped in the dusty silence of her adobe mansion overlooking the silver mines of Copperton Valley, Arizona territory. The 27 pearls scattered across the hardwood floor like teardrops, each one a witness to the violence that would ignite a manhunt spanning 4 territories and birth a legend that still echoes through the canyons of the American Southwest today. This is the story of Esther, a young woman whose name was deliberately erased from newspaper headlines, but whose single act of defiance shattered the illusion of absolute control that wealthy mine owners desperately needed to maintain. Because when the powerless finally refused to remain silent, the tremors don't just shake the ground, they bring down entire empires built on the backs of the broken. What happened in that moonlit room would transform a seamstress into a ghost story that mine barons would spend fortunes trying to bury. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The cultured pearls lay scattered across the polished oak floor like fallen stars, each one catching the amber glow of the kerosene lamp that had witnessed Isabella Vrenneth's final moments. 27 perfect spheres, each worth more than most families earned in a year, now served as evidence in what would become the most notorious crime in Arizona Territory's brief history. The pearl necklace had been a wedding gift from her husband, imported from the Orient at a cost of $300, designed to showcase the wealth that silver mining had brought to the Droswin family empire. Isabella's body lay crumpled beside her vanity table, her silk nightgown twisted around her legs, pale fingers still clutching at her throat where the pearl strand had done its deadly work. Her blue eyes, once proud and commanding, now stared sightlessly at the ceiling where shadows danced in the lamplight. The room smelled of expensive French perfume mixed with something else, something that would haunt the dreams of everyone who entered that space in the hours to come. Sheriff Therick Corvin would arrive at the Droswin mansion at dawn, summoned by a frantic servant who had discovered the scene while bringing morning tea. He would find the bedroom door unlocked, the window open to the desert breeze, and no sign of forced entry. The only clues were the scattered pearls, a small bloodstain on the Persian carpet, and the complete absence of Esther, the personal servant who had attended to Isabella Vrenneth's every need for the past 3 years. What Corvin couldn't know, standing in that death-scented room with his hat in his hands and his badge weighing heavy on his chest, was that he was looking at the first strike in a war that would reshape how the American West understood power, race, and the price of absolute control. The woman he would spend months hunting had vanished like smoke into the vast expanse of desert and canyon that surrounded Copperton Valley, carrying with her a story that would inspire and terrify in equal measure. The official investigation would conclude that Esther had murdered her mistress in a fit of jealous rage, stealing valuable jewelry before fleeing into the wilderness where she surely perished from exposure and wild animals. Newspaper accounts would describe her as a savage who had turned against the benevolent family that had provided her with food, shelter, and Christian guidance. The territorial governor would use the incident to justify stricter controls on the movements of enslaved people throughout the Southwest. But the stories that spread through the servant quarters and mining camps told a different version of events. They whispered that Isabella Vrenneth had finally pushed too far, demanded too much, inflicted one cruelty too many. They said that Esther had simply decided she would rather die free in the desert than live another day as property. They claimed that the pearl necklace had been divine justice, turning a symbol of wealth and status into an instrument of retribution. The truth, as it often does, lay somewhere between the official narrative and the whispered legends. What happened in that moonlit bedroom on September 8, 1852, was neither random violence nor divine intervention, but the inevitable result of a system that treated human beings as chattel and expected them to accept their degradation with gratitude. Esther had endured 3 years of systematic humiliation, watched her spirit slowly crushed under the weight of absolute powerlessness, until something inside her finally snapped like those cultured pearls hitting the hardwood floor. The transformation from victim to killer had taken less than 60 seconds, but the reverberations would echo across the territory for decades to come. Every mine owner, every plantation master, every person who had built their fortune on the backs of enslaved labor would lie awake at night wondering if their own servants harbored similar thoughts of revenge. The comfortable fiction that enslaved people were naturally docile, grateful for their care, and incapable of organized resistance, had been shattered as thoroughly as Isabella's pearl necklace. By sunrise, 3 posses would be forming in Copperton Valley, armed with rifles, tracking dogs, and the absolute certainty that swift justice would restore the natural order. They would follow false trails into box canyons, chase shadows across alkali flats, and spend weeks combing through Apache territory in search of a woman who seemed to have vanished from the earth itself. What they found instead would challenge every assumption they held about the nature of power and the limits of human endurance. The hunt for Esther would become the largest manhunt in territorial history, involving federal marshals, local militia, and bounty hunters drawn by the $500 reward that Gavril Droswin posted for her capture. Dead or alive, the posters would read, showing a sketch that bore little resemblance to the woman they sought. The authorities needed her to be a monster, a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happened when the natural order was disrupted. Instead, she would become something far more dangerous. A symbol of resistance that no amount of reward money could capture, no number of tracking dogs could corner, and no official narrative could contain. The scattered pearls on Isabella Vrenneth's bedroom floor marked not just the end of one woman's life, but the beginning of a legend that would outlive the silver mines, the territorial government, and the very system of bondage that had created it. Copperton Valley sprawled across 12,000 acres of high desert country, where the morning sun painted red sandstone cliffs the color of dried blood, and the evening wind carried the scent of sage across alkali flats that stretched to the horizon. The valley had been carved from Apache hunting grounds by men who measured progress in tons of silver ore extracted from the earth, and human lives expended in the process of extraction. By 1852, it housed the largest mining operation in Arizona Territory, employing over 800 workers in conditions that would shame the devil himself. The Droswin Silver Empire dominated the landscape like a feudal kingdom, with company-owned mines, smelters, and processing facilities scattered across the valley floor like monuments to industrial ambition. Massive stamp mills thundered day and night, crushing ore with the rhythmic precision of mechanical heartbeats, while coal smoke from the smelters painted the sky a perpetual shade of gray. The sound of progress was deafening. Steam engines, hydraulic pumps, and the constant percussion of hammers on rock that echoed off canyon walls with the persistence of artillery bombardment. The town of Copperton perched on a natural shelf of rock overlooking the valley, its streets laid out in a rigid grid that reflected the mathematical precision with which Gavril Droswin approached all aspects of his empire. Main Street featured a bank, general store, saloon, and courthouse, all constructed from imported brick that proclaimed the permanence of civilization in this raw country. The residential district climbed the hillside in carefully stratified layers. Company executives in substantial homes near the summit, skilled workers in modest frame houses on the middle slopes, and laborers in rough barracks near the valley floor. At the apex of this social pyramid sat the Droswin Mansion, a 3-story adobe structure with thick walls designed to withstand both desert heat and Apache raids. Imported furnishings filled rooms cooled by an ingenious system of water-fed air ducts, while terraced gardens displayed flowers and vegetables that survived in the arid climate only through constant irrigation. The mansion's elevated position provided commanding views of the entire operation, allowing Gavril to survey his domain from the comfort of his mahogany-paneled study. The labor force that made this empire possible represented a carefully constructed hierarchy of exploitation that maximized profit while minimizing the risk of organized resistance. Free white miners, mostly Irish and German immigrants, earned $3 per day and enjoyed the theoretical protection of territorial law. Mexican laborers received half that wage for the same work, but lacked legal recourse when payment was delayed or withheld. Chinese workers, imported under contracts that amounted to indentured servitude, toiled in the most dangerous underground shafts for subsistence wages. At the bottom of this pyramid were the enslaved workers, primarily African Americans who had been brought west by their owners, seeking opportunities in the mining boom. They received no wages at all, subsisting on minimal rations while performing the most brutal and hazardous tasks in the operation. Their legal status remained ambiguous in the territory, where federal anti-slavery laws conflicted with the economic interests of powerful mining companies and the racial prejudices of territorial officials. The physical environment of Copperton Valley reflected this social stratification with brutal clarity. The Mansion District enjoyed planted trees, paved streets, and gas lighting imported at considerable expense from San Francisco. The white workers' quarters featured wooden sidewalks, outhouses, and communal wells that provided adequate sanitation. Mexican laborers lived in adobe barracks with dirt floors and shared cooking facilities, while Chinese workers occupied converted mining shacks on the periphery of town. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The enslaved population inhabited a collection of earthen dugouts carved into the hillside below the smelters, where the constant rain of coal ash and sulfur smoke created living conditions that visitors compared to scenes from Dante's Inferno. These dwellings lacked windows, proper ventilation, or sanitary facilities, housing families of 6 or 8 people in spaces barely large enough for livestock. The proximity to the smelters meant that respiratory disease was endemic, while the lack of medical care ensured that minor injuries often became life-threatening infections. Water, the most precious commodity in the desert, was distributed according to the same racial hierarchy that governed every other aspect of life in Copperton Valley. The mansion and executive residences enjoyed unlimited access to spring water piped down from mountain sources. White workers received adequate rations for drinking and basic washing, while Mexican and Chinese laborers shared communal cisterns that were refilled weekly. The enslaved population relied on runoff from the smelting operations, water so contaminated with heavy metals and chemical byproducts that it frequently caused stomach ailments and skin conditions. The climate added another layer of hardship to an already brutal existence. Summer temperatures regularly exceeded 110 degrees Fahrenheit, turning the valley into a furnace that drained human bodies of moisture with relentless efficiency. Winter brought its own challenges, with freezing winds that howled down from the mountains and occasional snowstorms that could isolate the valley for weeks at a time. The desert's extremes showed no mercy to those forced to work regardless of weather conditions. Security throughout the valley was maintained by a private force of armed guards who answered directly to Gavril Droswin rather than any territorial authority. These men, recruited from among former soldiers and professional gunfighters, patrolled the perimeter on horseback and maintained watchtowers at strategic points throughout the operation. Their orders were simple: prevent theft of company property, including human property, and suppress any signs of organized resistance among the workforce. The isolation of Copperton Valley served as an additional barrier to escape or outside intervention. The nearest town lay 60 miles to the south across desert country, populated by Apache bands who showed little sympathy for refugees from the mining operations. Mountain ranges blocked easy passage to the east and west, while the northern route led into wilderness areas where survival required skills and resources that few possessed. This geographic imprisonment was as effective as any iron shackles in maintaining control over the workforce. Communication with the outside world occurred through weekly supply wagons that brought provisions and mail while carrying silver ingots to markets in California and Colorado. These wagon trains traveled under heavy guard and followed predetermined routes designed to minimize contact with hostile forces. The isolation meant that news from the broader territory often arrived weeks or months late, creating an information vacuum that company officials used to their advantage when managing labor relations. Within this controlled environment, Gavril Droswin had created what he considered a perfect microcosm of industrial efficiency, where every resource, including human resources, was utilized to maximum advantage. The system had operated without significant disruption for 6 years, generating enormous profits while maintaining the kind of absolute control that the plantation system had perfected in the antebellum South. What Droswin failed to understand was that perfection in oppression creates its own instabilities, and that the most dangerous revolutions often begin in the most controlled environments. Esther arrived at Copperton Valley in the spring of 1849, purchased at a New Orleans slave market for $750 by Gavril Droswin's representative, who had been instructed to acquire skilled domestic workers for the growing mansion staff. The bill of sale, preserved in the company archives, described her as Negro female, age approximately 19, experienced in fine needlework and household management, literate in English, of sound body and docile temperament. That final assessment would prove to be the most catastrophic misjudgment in the document's long history of human commodification. The journey from Louisiana to Arizona Territory had taken 3 months, traveling by riverboat to St. Louis, then by wagon train across Indian Territory and the southern reaches of the Colorado Plateau. Esther made the journey chained to 11 other enslaved people in the back of a supply wagon, enduring dust, heat, and the constant threat of Apache attacks while contemplating the vast distances that now separated her from everything she had ever known. The experience taught her valuable lessons about survival, navigation, and the weaknesses of armed convoys that she would later use to devastating effect. Her background remained largely mysterious even to those who claimed to own her, a deliberate obscurity that she had cultivated since adolescence as protection against the kind of scrutiny that often proved dangerous for enslaved people who possessed unusual skills or knowledge. What the company records didn't mention was that Esther had been born free in Savannah, Georgia, the daughter of a successful seamstress who had purchased her own freedom through years of careful saving and business acumen. The family's prosperity had made them targets during the economic panic of 1837, when white creditors used legal technicalities and forged documents to seize the property and persons of successful free blacks. Esther's mother, Isabella Vrenneth, had operated a dressmaking establishment that served the wealthy plantation families of coastal Georgia, creating elaborate gowns and formal wear that showcased her exceptional skills with needle and thread. The shop had employed 6 seamstresses and maintained contracts with some of the most prominent families in Savannah society, generating sufficient income to purchase freedom papers for the entire family and establish a comfortable middle-class lifestyle that included a modest house, savings account, and plans for further expansion. The destruction of this life had been swift and merciless, orchestrated by a coalition of white competitors who resented the success of a free black business and creditors who saw an opportunity to seize valuable assets through legal manipulation. Forged debt documents appeared overnight, claiming that Isabella had borrowed against her freedom papers to finance business expansion. When she protested that the signatures were false and the debts fabricated, the local magistrate ruled that the burden of proof lay with the defendant, effectively requiring her to prove a negative while lacking access to legal representation. Within a week, everything was gone: the shop, the house, the savings, and most devastating of all, the freedom papers that had taken 15 years to earn. Isabella and her daughter were arrested as fugitive slaves and sold at auction to settle the manufactured debts, their previous status as free citizens erased as thoroughly as if it had never existed. The speed and efficiency of the operation demonstrated how little protection legal freedom actually provided when economic interests aligned against it. Esther carried the memory of this betrayal like a coal burning in her chest, fueling a rage that she learned to hide behind the mask of submissive competence that survival demanded. She had witnessed firsthand how quickly the law could be turned against those it claimed to protect, how easily the fiction of justice could be manipulated to serve the interests of power. These lessons shaped her understanding of the world in ways that her subsequent owners never suspected, creating a foundation of cynicism and strategic thinking that would eventually prove lethal. The skills that made her valuable in the domestic slave market had been acquired through years of legitimate training in her mother's shop, where she had learned not only advanced needlework techniques, but also the business practices necessary to operate a successful enterprise. She could read contracts, calculate costs, manage inventory, and negotiate with suppliers, abilities that far exceeded what was expected of household servants, but which she carefully concealed to avoid unwanted attention. Her literacy extended beyond basic reading to include familiarity with legal documents, newspaper accounts, and business correspondence, knowledge acquired through systematic eavesdropping, and careful observation during her years in various households. She had developed the ability to appear completely absorbed in her work, while actually monitoring conversations around her, gathering information about business dealings, family finances, and political developments that might affect her situation. The 3-year journey that brought her to the Droswin mansion included stops at plantations in Mississippi and Texas, where she observed different management styles and resistance strategies employed by both owners and enslaved workers. Each experience added to her understanding of the system's weaknesses and the methods that might be used to exploit them. She learned which overseers could be bribed, which masters were vulnerable to flattery, and which escape routes offered the best chances of success. By the time she reached Copperton Valley, Esther had developed what amounted to a comprehensive intelligence network, maintaining contact with enslaved people across the territory through a combination of coded messages and careful relationship building. She understood supply routes, guard rotations, communication schedules, and the political tensions that affected territorial law enforcement. This knowledge, combined with her skills in domestic management, made her invaluable to the Droswin household, while remaining completely invisible to those who believed they controlled her. Her assignment to Isabella Vrenneth's personal service provided access to the most intimate details of the family's operations, including financial records, correspondence with business partners, and discussions about territorial politics that revealed the extent of the Droswin influence over local law enforcement. She learned about planned expansions, labor disputes, and the various legal and illegal methods used to maintain control over the workforce. Perhaps most importantly, her position allowed her to observe the psychological dynamics within the mansion, identifying the insecurities, fears, and weaknesses that drove the behavior of those who held absolute power over her life. She studied Isabella's vanity, Gavril's paranoia, and the tensions between various family members and business associates, mapping the emotional landscape with the same precision that she applied to needlework patterns. The persona she presented to the household was that of a grateful, competent servant who had found her proper place in the natural order of things. She spoke only when addressed, never offered opinions on matters beyond her assigned duties, and demonstrated the kind of quiet efficiency that made her presence nearly invisible, despite her constant proximity to sensitive conversations and valuable information. This carefully constructed invisibility became her greatest weapon, allowing her to move through the mansion like a ghost while gathering the intelligence that would eventually prove decisive. What neither Isabella nor Gavril realized was that their trusted servant had been methodically documenting their crimes for 3 years, memorizing every detail of the illegal labor practices, safety violations, and corrupt arrangements with territorial officials that kept the Droswin Empire operating outside the reach of federal law. She had identified evidence caches, witness testimony, and documentary proof that could destroy the entire operation if properly presented to authorities beyond the reach of Droswin influence. The question that haunted her nights was not whether she possessed the information necessary to bring down her oppressors, but whether she would ever have the opportunity to use it. The isolation of Copperton Valley made escape seem nearly impossible, while the lack of legal standing for enslaved people meant that even the most damning evidence might be dismissed by territorial courts. The growing realization that justice might never come through legal channels planted the seeds of a more direct approach to settling accounts. Isabella Vrenneth Droswin ruled the domestic sphere of the mansion with the absolute authority of a queen governing her private kingdom, wielding power over the lives of 15 household servants, with a combination of calculated cruelty and unpredictable violence that kept everyone in a state of constant terror. At 28, she possessed the kind of delicate beauty that attracted admiration in social settings while concealing a nature so thoroughly corrupted by privilege that she had lost all capacity for recognizing the humanity of those she commanded. Her marriage to Gavril Droswin 3 years earlier had been a strategic alliance between 2 of Georgia's most prominent slave-owning families, bringing together the Vrenneth cotton fortune with the emerging Droswin mining empire in a partnership designed to maximize political influence and economic dominance across multiple industries. The ceremony had been celebrated as a triumph of Southern aristocracy, uniting bloodlines that traced their wealth back to the earliest days of the plantation system. Isabella's upbringing on the Vrenneth plantation near Savannah had instilled in her the fundamental belief that racial hierarchy was not merely social convention, but divine mandate, that the enslavement of African Americans represented the natural order established by God for the benefit of civilization itself. This ideology shaped every aspect of her worldview, from her casual assumption that enslaved people existed solely for her convenience, to her genuine bewilderment when they showed signs of independent thought or emotional complexity. The daily routine of the Droswin household reflected this philosophy through a system of micromanagements and psychological torments designed to reinforce absolute submission among the domestic staff. Isabella maintained detailed schedules for every servant, specifying not only their work assignments but also their movements, conversations, and even facial expressions during the performance of their duties. Deviation from these standards, however minor, resulted in immediate punishment, ranging from public humiliation to physical violence. Her favorite disciplinary tool was the silver-headed riding crop that had belonged to her father, a weapon that she wielded with the skill of someone who had been practicing cruelty since childhood. The crop left distinctive marks that served as both punishment and warning to other servants, creating a climate of fear that permeated every corner of the mansion. She took particular pleasure in administering beatings in front of other staff members, understanding that public humiliation amplified the psychological impact of physical pain. The servant quarters reflected Isabella's obsession with control through their deliberately degrading conditions. Despite the mansion's luxury and the family's enormous wealth, the domestic staff lived in a converted stable that lacked basic sanitary facilities, adequate ventilation, or protection from the desert's temperature extremes. Sleeping arrangements consisted of straw mattresses on dirt floors, with 12 people sharing a space originally designed for 6 horses. Food rations were calculated to provide the minimum nutrition necessary to maintain work capacity while ensuring constant hunger that could be used as a motivational tool. Isabella personally supervised the distribution of meals, adjusting portions based on her assessment of each servant's performance and attitude. Those who showed insufficient gratitude or enthusiasm for their work found their rations reduced, creating a competition among the staff that prevented solidarity and mutual support. The psychological dimension of Isabella's control system involved constant surveillance and the deliberate fostering of mistrust among the servants. She maintained a network of informants who reported on private conversations, suspicious behavior, and any signs of dissatisfaction among their fellow workers. These informants received preferential treatment and small privileges that created resentment and suspicion throughout the household staff, making organized resistance virtually impossible. Her relationship with Esther began as a source of particular satisfaction, as Isabella believed she had acquired the perfect personal servant, skilled, educated enough to understand complex instructions, but sufficiently broken by previous experiences to accept her subordinate position without question. The irony that she had chosen as her most trusted attendant the person who would eventually become her destroyer reflected the fundamental blindness that privilege creates regarding the inner lives of those it oppresses. The specific nature of Isabella's abuse toward Esther revealed both the sadistic creativity that unlimited power can inspire and the psychological insecurities that drove her need for absolute control. She seemed to take particular pleasure in forcing an obviously intelligent woman to perform degrading tasks that served no practical purpose beyond demonstrating dominance. These included requiring Esther to crawl on hands and knees while cleaning floors that were already spotless, standing motionless for hours while holding Isabella's jewelry during social gatherings, and enduring verbal humiliation in front of guests who found such displays of mastery entertaining. The sexual dimension of plantation power was never far from the surface of these interactions, as Isabella clearly understood that her husband's inspections of the female staff served purposes beyond household management. Rather than feeling threatened by these arrangements, she seemed to derive vicarious pleasure from her husband's exploitation of women who had no legal recourse or means of resistance. This acceptance of sexual violence as a normal aspect of domestic management reflected the moral corruption that the slave system created even among those who benefited from it. Isabella's social position within territorial society amplified her power within the household by providing external validation for her cruelty and protection from any potential criticism of her methods. The wives of other mining executives and territorial officials regularly visited the mansion for tea parties and social gatherings, where the conversation often centered on the challenges of managing enslaved domestic help. These discussions served as informal training sessions in the techniques of psychological and physical control. The territorial legal system provided additional layers of protection for Isabella's actions through laws that defined enslaved people as property rather than persons, making violence against them a matter of property damage rather than assault. Even in the unlikely event that a servant could find someone willing to file charges on their behalf, the legal proceedings would require testimony from white witnesses, physical evidence that met standards designed to protect slave owners, and judges who were economically dependent on the mining industry. The isolation of Copperton Valley created another barrier to accountability by limiting contact with federal authorities or anti-slavery activists who might challenge the legal fiction that justified Isabella's behavior. The territorial government remained largely theoretical in remote mining districts, where company officials exercised de facto sovereignty over all aspects of life, including law enforcement, judicial proceedings, and the definition of acceptable behavior toward enslaved workers. Isabella's confidence in her absolute immunity from consequences shaped her escalating cruelty toward Esther during the summer of 1852, as she seemed to view the intelligent young woman as a particular challenge to her authority that required increasingly harsh methods to resolve. What she failed to understand was that intelligence combined with desperate circumstances can create a far more dangerous opponent than simple physical strength or conventional weapons. The tragic irony of Isabella's situation was that her cruelty toward Esther stemmed partly from an unconscious recognition of abilities and qualities that she herself lacked, despite her advantages of birth and education. The careful needlework, the quick comprehension of complex instructions, the obvious literacy that Esther tried unsuccessfully to conceal, all served as reminders of what genuine accomplishment looked like compared to the inherited privilege that Isabella had mistaken for personal merit. This psychological dynamic created a spiral of escalating violence, as Isabella attempted to destroy in Esther the very qualities that she unconsciously envied, not understanding that each new humiliation was adding fuel to a fire that would eventually consume everything she thought she controlled. The pearl necklace that would become the instrument of her destruction symbolized this fundamental misunderstanding, representing wealth obtained through others, labor, while remaining completely vulnerable to those same laborers when circumstances finally shifted. The evening of September 7, 1852, began with Isabella's announcement that she would be hosting a dinner party the following night to celebrate the arrival of Territorial Judge Orlith Danavar, whose visit to Copperton Valley would provide an opportunity to discuss pending legislation that could affect the legal status of enslaved workers throughout Arizona Territory. The guest list included every significant mine owner, territorial official, and business leader within 100 miles, making it the most important social gathering in the valley's brief history. Esther received the news while polishing silver in the mansion's dining room, where she had learned to work with the focused concentration that made her virtually invisible, while remaining close enough to overhear conversations that revealed the true nature of territorial politics. Isabella's excitement about the dinner party stemmed from her belief that Judge Danavar could be influenced to support legislation that would formalize the legal framework protecting slave owners' interests in the territory. The preparation for such an elaborate event required 2 days of intensive work by the entire household staff, with Isabella supervising every detail from menu planning to table arrangements with the obsessive attention of someone who understood that social success could translate directly into political and economic advantage. She had ordered specific wines from California, commissioned special dishes from the territorial capital, and arranged for musicians to provide entertainment throughout the evening. Esther's role in these preparations involved not only her usual duties as personal attendant, but also responsibility for coordinating the work of other servants, ensuring that every aspect of Isabella's appearance and the mansion's presentation met the exacting standards required for such a high-profile gathering. This additional responsibility provided her with unprecedented access to information about the guest list, conversation topics, and political objectives that the dinner party was designed to achieve. The specific catalyst for what followed occurred during the afternoon of September 7th, when Isabella discovered that one of her prized silk gowns had developed a small tear in the sleeve, apparently caused by careless handling during routine cleaning. The damage was minimal, easily repaired by someone with Esther's skills, but Isabella's reaction revealed the psychological instability that unlimited power had created in her character. Rather than simply requesting repairs, Isabella flew into a rage that seemed to surprise even her with its intensity, screaming accusations about the deliberate destruction of her property and demanding to know which servant was responsible for the damage. When no one could provide a satisfactory explanation, she decided that Esther, as the person responsible for supervising clothing care, must be held accountable regardless of whether she had actually caused the problem. The punishment Isabella devised reflected both her creativity in designing humiliation and her complete failure to understand the dangerous psychological territory she was entering. She ordered Esther to strip naked in the courtyard behind the mansion, where the other servants were forced to watch, while Isabella used her silver-headed riding crop to deliver 25 lashes across Esther's back and shoulders. The beating itself was brutal enough, but Isabella's commentary during the punishment revealed the depth of her psychological corruption and the specific nature of her obsession with breaking Esther's spirit. She provided a running narrative about the natural inferiority of the African race, the divine mandate for slavery, and the necessity of harsh discipline to maintain proper order in civilized society. What made the incident particularly devastating was Isabella's decision to invite several neighboring plantation wives to witness the punishment, turning Esther's suffering into a social event that combined entertainment with education about proper slave management techniques. These women, dressed in their finest afternoon attire, watched the beating while sipping tea and offering helpful suggestions about alternative disciplinary methods. The psychological impact of this public humiliation extended far beyond the physical pain of the whipping, as Esther was forced to endure not only the violence itself, but also the casual conversation among the white women about her body, her likely endurance, and the effectiveness of various punishment techniques. The complete dehumanization implicit in their behavior represented a form of spiritual violence that cut deeper than any physical wound. Following the beating, Isabella ordered Esther to continue her preparation work for the dinner party while wearing the torn and bloodied clothing that had been cut from her back during the punishment. This requirement to work while injured, visible to other servants and household visitors, served as a constant reminder of what happened to those who failed to meet expectations. The evening brought additional humiliation when Isabella decided that Esther should serve dinner to the gathered guests while wearing a special collar that Isabella had commissioned from the territorial blacksmith. The collar, made of polished silver with the Droswin family crest engraved on a nameplate, was designed to showcase the family's wealth while marking Esther as particularly valuable property. As Esther moved around the dinner table serving courses and refilling wine glasses, she was forced to listen to conversations about the territorial legislation that would determine the fate of thousands of enslaved people throughout the Southwest. The guests discussed these human beings as economic units, debating the relative merits of different control techniques and sharing stories about successful resistance suppression with the casual tone normally reserved for discussions of livestock management. Judge Danavar, a dignified man in his 50s who commanded respect throughout the territory, proved to be enthusiastically supportive of legislation that would strengthen slave owners' legal rights while reducing the already minimal protections available to enslaved people. His conversation with Gavril Droswin included detailed discussions about the economic benefits of slavery in mining operations and the necessity of preventing federal interference in territorial labor arrangements. The turning point came when Isabella, emboldened by wine and the admiration of her guests, decided to demonstrate her complete control over Esther by ordering her to kneel beside Isabella's chair throughout the remainder of the dinner. This position forced Esther to remain motionless on the floor, while conversations about her legal status as property continued around her, creating a tableau that perfectly illustrated the power dynamics the guests were working to preserve. The final catalyst occurred when one of the guests, a plantation owner from southern Arizona, commented admiringly on Esther's appearance and suggested that Isabella might consider breeding her to produce additional valuable offspring. The casual discussion of her reproductive potential, conducted as if she were livestock being evaluated for breeding purposes, while she knelt helplessly beside the table, finally broke through the psychological barriers that had allowed her to endure 3 years of systematic dehumanization. What the dinner guests failed to notice was the change in Esther's breathing, the way her hands trembled slightly as she maintained her submissive posture, or the expression that crossed her face when Judge Danavar raised his wine glass in a toast to the natural order that places each race in its proper sphere for the benefit of Christian civilization. They were too absorbed in their own comfortable assumptions about power and privilege to recognize that they were witnessing the precise moment when their victim finally decided that death would be preferable to another day of accepting their definition of her humanity. As the evening progressed and the guests became increasingly intoxicated with both alcohol and their own sense of absolute authority, Esther remained kneeling beside Isabella's chair, no longer listening to the conversation, but instead methodically reviewing everything she had learned about the mansion's layout, the family's routines, and the specific vulnerabilities that 3 years of careful observation had revealed. The transformation from victim to predator was complete, waiting only for the right moment to reveal itself through action that would shatter every assumption the dinner guests held about the natural order they claimed to represent. The grandfather clock in the mansion's main hallway chimed 11 times as the last dinner guest departed into the cool desert night, their carriages disappearing down the winding road that led from the Droswin estate to the main settlement of Copperton Valley. The sound of wheels on gravel faded gradually until only the whisper of wind through the cottonwood trees remained, carrying with it the scent of sage and the distant rumble of the mining operations that never truly ceased their mechanical heartbeat. Esther stood motionless in the dining room, clearing crystal glasses and silver plates with the mechanical precision that 3 years of servitude had burned into her muscle memory. Her movements betrayed nothing of the calculations running through her mind as she stacked bone china worth more than most families earned in a decade, each piece representing hours of human labor extracted through systems of bondage that the evening's guests had spent 3 hours celebrating and planning to expand. Isabella remained in the parlor, reclining on a velvet chaise lounge imported from New Orleans at a cost that could have purchased the freedom of 6 families. She sipped brandy from a crystal snifter while reviewing the evening's social triumphs, particularly pleased with Judge Danivar's enthusiastic support for the territorial legislation that would formalize the legal framework protecting slave owners' interests throughout the Southwest. The silver collar still encircled Esther's throat, its polished surface reflecting lamplight as she moved through her duties. The weight of the metal against her skin served as a constant reminder of the evening's humiliations, but also as something else, something that Isabella, in her comfortable arrogance, had failed to recognize. The collar was a symbol, but symbols could be transformed into weapons when circumstances demanded such transformation. Gavril had retired to his study immediately after the guests departed, explaining that important correspondence required his attention before morning. The territorial legislature would convene in 2 weeks, and the mining consortium needed to coordinate their lobbying efforts to ensure passage of favorable legislation. His absence from the main living areas created the isolation that Esther had been waiting for, the window of opportunity that might not occur again for months. The mansion's domestic staff had been dismissed to their quarters after completing their assigned tasks, leaving only Esther to attend to Isabella's nighttime requirements. This arrangement, which Isabella preferred because it allowed for more intimate control over her favorite victim, would prove to be the final miscalculation in a lifetime of underestimating the people she claimed to own. Esther completed her cleaning duties with careful attention to every detail, understanding that thoroughness now might provide crucial advantages later. She extinguished the dining room lamps, secured the silver service in its locked cabinet, and ensured that all evidence of the evening's gathering had been properly stored or disposed of. The methodical nature of these tasks provided a counterpoint to the chaos building in her mind, the careful balance between planning and rage that would determine whether the next hour brought liberation or merely a different form of death. The house settled into its nighttime rhythms as desert temperatures dropped and the adobe walls began their nightly process of releasing the heat they had absorbed during the day. The familiar sounds of expansion and contraction created a symphony of creaks and whispers that Esther had learned to interpret during 3 years of moving through these rooms in darkness, understanding which noises were normal and which might indicate unexpected activity. Isabella's voice drifted from the parlor, summoning her personal attendant with the casual authority of someone who had never questioned her right to demand absolute obedience from another human being. The tone carried undertones of satisfaction and anticipation that suggested the evening's entertainment was not yet concluded, that additional humiliations were being planned for the woman who had served as both servant and symbol throughout the dinner party. Esther approached the parlor with measured steps, her bare feet silent on the Persian runners that covered the hallway floors. The silver collar caught the lamplight as she moved, creating small reflections that danced across the wallpaper like omens of the violence that was about to unfold. Her hands remained steady despite the adrenaline beginning to course through her system, the natural preparation for combat that her body understood even before her conscious mind had committed to the course of action. The parlor represented everything that was wrong with the system that had destroyed her family and condemned her to 3 years of systematic dehumanization. Imported furniture that cost more than entire communities could earn, artwork purchased with money extracted from human suffering, luxury that existed only because other human beings had been reduced to the status of livestock. The room was a monument to the moral corruption that absolute power created in those who wielded it without accountability. Isabella reclined in her evening gown, a creation of silken lace that had required 30 hours of skilled labor to complete, worn once and likely to be discarded tomorrow in favor of something newer and more expensive. The contrast between her casual luxury and the brutal conditions endured by those who created her wealth represented the fundamental injustice that Esther had decided could no longer be tolerated through passive resistance or patient endurance. The pearl necklace lay across Isabella's throat like a noose, waiting for the right moment to fulfill its destiny. Each pearl represented a life destroyed by the system that Isabella embodied, wealth extracted through violence and maintained through terror. The irony that such beauty could emerge from the suffering of oysters seemed particularly appropriate given the circumstances that had brought Esther to this moment of decision. "Come here," Isabella commanded without looking up from her brandy, her voice carrying the lazy satisfaction of someone who had spent the evening being celebrated for her mastery over other human beings. "I want to discuss your performance tonight. There were several moments when your attitude seemed insufficiently grateful for the privilege of serving such distinguished guests." Esther approached with the submissive posture that Isabella expected, but her mind was cataloging every detail of the room's layout, every potential weapon, every possible escape route. The kerosene lamps provided adequate lighting while creating shadows that could offer concealment. The thick adobe walls would muffle sounds that might otherwise alert the household staff or Gavrel in his distant study. "Kneel," Isabella instructed, gesturing to a spot beside her chair where Esther could be easily reached for whatever punishment or humiliation was being planned. The command was delivered with the casual confidence of someone who had never imagined that absolute power might create its own vulnerabilities. That complete control over another person required trust that such control would never be challenged. Esther knelt as instructed, but something fundamental had shifted in her compliance. Where 3 years of conditioning had created automatic obedience, there was now calculation. Where systematic brutality had instilled fear, there was now cold analysis. The transformation was invisible to Isabella, who saw only the familiar sight of her favorite victim, assuming the position that had become symbolic of the natural order she believed herself to represent. "Judge Danavar was quite impressed with our household management," Isabella continued, taking another sip of brandy while studying Esther's kneeling form with the satisfied expression of someone admiring a particularly well-trained animal. "He commented specifically on how well-disciplined our domestic staff appeared, especially you. I explained that proper training requires firmness and consistency." The words washed over Esther without penetrating the focused calm that had replaced 3 years of accumulated rage. She had moved beyond anger into something far more dangerous, the cold clarity that emerges when a person finally accepts that survival requires the willingness to kill. The psychological barriers that civilization constructs to prevent such moments had been systematically demolished by Isabella's own actions. However, Isabella's tone shifted slightly, taking on the edge that always preceded punishment. "There were also moments when I detected something in your expression that suggested insufficient appreciation for your position here. A certain subtle resistance that needs to be corrected before it becomes a more serious problem." Isabella reached for the silver-headed riding crop that lay on the table beside her chair, the same weapon that had been used for the afternoon's public beating and countless other acts of violence designed to maintain proper order among the household staff. The sight of the crop triggered memories not just of personal pain, but of every beating Esther had witnessed, every act of casual cruelty that had been justified as necessary discipline. But as Isabella's fingers closed around the crop's handle, Esther's hands moved with the fluid precision of someone who had been planning this moment for weeks. The pearl necklace came away from Isabella's throat so smoothly that the motion seemed like a caress rather than an attack, the clasp opening silently as trained fingers found exactly the right pressure point. Isabella's eyes widened in confusion rather than alarm, her brandy-fogged mind struggling to process what was happening as the necklace settled around her throat in a configuration that transformed luxury into instrument of execution. The pearls caught the lamplight as they tightened, each one reflecting the flames that would soon illuminate Isabella's final moments. "What are you?" Isabella began, but the words were cut short as the necklace constricted with the inexorable pressure of justice finally finding its target. Her free hand flew to her throat, clawing at the pearls that had become a garrote, while her other hand still gripped the riding crop that had been the symbol of her authority over human life. Esther maintained her position behind Isabella's chair, using leverage and positioning rather than raw strength to maintain the deadly pressure. 3 years of careful observation had taught her exactly how much force was required, exactly how to position herself to prevent Isabella from gaining the mechanical advantage necessary to break free. The knowledge that had once been used to avoid beatings was now being applied to deliver one final, definitive punishment. The struggle lasted exactly 63 seconds, each one counted off by the grandfather clock, whose mechanical precision provided a counterpoint to the organic chaos of death by strangulation. Isabella's attempts to cry for help were reduced to wet gasping sounds that barely carried beyond the parlor walls, while her efforts to reach Esther with the riding crop grew progressively weaker as oxygen deprivation began to affect her coordination. The transformation in Isabella's expression as she realized what was happening represented a moment of perfect justice, the exact reversal of power that Esther had been dreaming about for 3 years. The casual confidence that had characterized Isabella's treatment of her servants gave way to desperate fear, then to the kind of pleading that she had ignored when it came from her victims, and finally to the glazed emptiness that marked the transition from life to corpse. When the struggle ended, Esther remained motionless for a full minute, staring at the woman who had personified everything evil about the system that had destroyed her family and condemned her to 3 years of systematic torture. The silence in the parlor was complete except for the soft hiss of the kerosene lamps and the distant sound of wind through the cottonwood trees that marked the passage of time in the natural world outside the mansion's walls. Isabella's body had slumped forward in the chair, her face pressed against the velvet upholstery that had cost more than most families earned in a lifetime. The pearl necklace remained around her throat, its clasp broken by the violence of her struggle, individual pearls scattered across the floor like tears shed by the system that had finally received the justice it had spent so long avoiding. The riding crop lay on the carpet where it had fallen from Isabella's lifeless fingers, its silver head reflecting lamplight in a pattern that seemed to mock the authority it had once represented. The weapon that had caused so much pain and humiliation had proved useless when its wielder faced someone who had finally decided that death was preferable to another day of accepting degradation. Esther stood slowly, her legs trembling slightly from the physical exertion and emotional release of 3 years of suppressed rage. The silver collar still encircled her throat, but its meaning had been transformed by the violence that had just occurred. Where it had once symbolized ownership and subjugation, it now represented something else entirely, a declaration of war against the entire system that had created such symbols. The immediate question was not remorse or regret, emotions that belonged to people who still believed in the possibility of justice through legal channels. The question was survival, and whether the next few hours would bring liberation or simply a different form of death. Either way, Isabella Vrenneth would never again use her position to destroy another human being's dignity. The sound of footsteps in the hallway outside the parlor indicated that Gavril had finished his correspondence and was preparing to retire for the evening. The routine that Esther had memorized over 3 years suggested that he would check on his wife before ascending to their bedroom, creating a window of perhaps 2 minutes before Isabella's body was discovered and the alarm was raised. Esther moved with the fluid efficiency of someone who had spent months planning for exactly this scenario, gathering the scattered pearls while stepping carefully around Isabella's corpse. Each pearl represented evidence that could be used to identify the murder weapon, but they also represented wealth that might prove useful in the desperate flight that would begin within minutes. The kerosene lamp nearest Isabella's chair flickered as Esther extinguished it, creating shadows that would help conceal the scene from casual observation while buying precious additional minutes before the discovery was made. The dying light played across Isabella's face, peaceful now in death in a way that it had never been in life, when cruelty and entitlement had twisted her features into expressions of contempt for anyone she considered beneath her station. The grandfather clock chimed 11:30 as Esther slipped from the parlor toward the rear of the mansion, where a servant's door provided access to the gardens and the maze of irrigation channels that carried water from the mountain springs to the mining operations below. The same knowledge of the estate's layout that had made her valuable as a domestic servant would now determine whether she survived the next 24 hours as a fugitive from the largest manhunt in territorial history. Gavril Droswin discovered his wife's body at precisely 11:47 p.m., when he entered the parlor to bid her good night before retiring to his study for a final review of territorial legislation that could affect mining operations throughout the Southwest. The scene that greeted him defied immediate comprehension. Isabella slumped forward in her chair, the pearl necklace that had been his wedding gift now twisted around her throat like a garrote, individual pearls scattered across the Persian carpet like evidence of violence that his mind refused to process. His first response was denial, rather than alarm, the natural reaction of someone whose entire worldview depended on the belief that such things simply could not happen in his carefully controlled domain. Isabella appeared to be sleeping, perhaps having consumed too much brandy during the evening's celebrations, and the pearl necklace had somehow become tangled during her rest. The alternative explanation was so far outside his experience that his brain simply rejected it as impossible. The terrible reality became undeniable when he touched her shoulder and found the cold stillness that marked the transition from life to corpse. Isabella's skin had already begun the process of cooling that would mark her death for the coroner's investigation, while her eyes stared sightlessly at the velvet upholstery that had cushioned her final moments. The pearl necklace remained embedded in the flesh of her throat, its delicate strand having proved more effective than any conventional weapon. Gavril's scream brought the household staff running from their quarters, but by the time they reached the parlor, Esther had already vanished into the maze of irrigation channels that honeycombed the valley floor. The same water system that sustained the mining operations now provided cover for the woman who had just shattered every assumption about the natural order that governed relations between masters and slaves in the American Southwest. Sheriff Esther Corvan arrived at the mansion within 30 minutes of receiving Gavril's frantic message, accompanied by Deputy Fendril Caro and 2 territorial marshals who happened to be visiting Copperton Valley on unrelated business. The scene they found challenged every precedent in their collective law enforcement experience, not because of the violence itself, but because of who had committed it and against whom. The investigation revealed details that transformed a domestic tragedy into a territorial crisis. The pearl necklace had been used with surgical precision, applied with knowledge of human anatomy that suggested either medical training or careful study of the most effective methods of strangulation. The lack of defensive wounds on Isabella's hands indicated that the attack had come from someone she trusted completely, someone who had been close enough to apply the necklace before she could react. Most disturbing of all was the complete absence of evidence suggesting robbery or random violence. Isabella's jewelry remained untouched except for the murder weapon itself, expensive items lay scattered throughout the parlor without being disturbed, and nothing appeared to have been taken from the mansion despite the wealth displayed in every room. This was not the work of a desperate thief or spontaneous violence, but a calculated execution carried out by someone with specific motivation and careful planning. The immediate response revealed the deep fears that Isabella's murder had awakened among the territorial elite. Within 6 hours, every mine owner, plantation operator, and territorial official within 100 miles had been notified of the incident and warned to increase security around their own households. The possibility that other enslaved domestic workers might be inspired by Esther's example created a climate of paranoia that infected every aspect of daily life. Governor Isabella Vrenneth issued a territorial proclamation before dawn, establishing a reward of $1,000 for Esther's capture dead or alive, and authorizing the use of federal marshals, territorial militia, and private security forces in the largest manhunt in Arizona Territory's brief history. The proclamation described her as an extremely dangerous fugitive who poses a threat to public safety and the maintenance of lawful order throughout the territory. The search began with systematic examination of the mansion and surrounding grounds by tracking specialists who had earned their reputation hunting Apache raiders through some of the most challenging terrain in the Southwest. The trail they discovered led from the mansion's rear entrance through the garden areas toward the irrigation system that carried mountain water to the valley's mining operations, suggesting that Esther possessed detailed knowledge of the estate's infrastructure. The irrigation channels presented both opportunity and challenge for the pursuing forces. The network of waterways extended for miles through desert country, providing concealment and drinking water for someone attempting to escape on foot, while creating a maze of possible routes that made systematic tracking extremely difficult. The channels also connected to natural wash systems that could carry a fugitive deep into Apache territory, beyond the reach of territorial law enforcement. Captain Rowan Stravin arrived from the territorial capital with 20 federal marshals and authorization to coordinate all law enforcement resources in the territory for the duration of the manhunt. His experience tracking fugitive slaves throughout the antebellum South had earned him a reputation for relentless pursuit and creative interrogation techniques that usually produced results within days rather than weeks. Stravin's first action was to establish a command post at the Droswin mansion, where he could coordinate multiple search teams while maintaining direct communication with territorial authorities and federal officials in Washington, who were monitoring the situation with growing concern. The murder of a prominent white woman by an enslaved person represented exactly the kind of incident that could destabilize the entire territorial government if not resolved quickly and decisively. The interrogation of the mansion's remaining domestic staff began immediately, conducted with the kind of intensity that Strangled had perfected during years of suppressing slave rebellions throughout the South. Each servant faced hours of questioning about Esther's behavior, conversations, and possible accomplices among the workforce, while physical persuasion techniques encouraged complete honesty about any information that might aid in her capture. The results of these interrogations revealed details that made Esther's escape even more troubling for the authorities. Multiple witnesses confirmed that she possessed literacy skills far beyond what was expected of domestic workers, had demonstrated detailed knowledge of territorial politics and mining operations, and had maintained contact with enslaved workers throughout the valley through a network that no one fully understood. Most alarming was testimony suggesting that Esther had been systematically gathering information about the Droswin family's business operations, political connections, and illegal labor practices for months before the murder. This evidence transformed the investigation from a simple manhunt into a counterintelligence operation designed to determine what sensitive information might have been compromised and how it could be used against territorial interests. The search teams fanned out across the valley in a coordinated pattern designed to eliminate possible escape routes while driving the fugitive toward predetermined capture points where overwhelming force could be brought to bear. Tracking dogs followed scent trails through the irrigation system, while mounted patrols established checkpoints on every road leading out of the valley. The operation represented the largest deployment of law enforcement resources in territorial history. However, Esther's 3-year observation of the valley's security procedures had revealed weaknesses that the authorities never suspected existed. She had memorized guard rotations, identified gaps in patrol coverage, and established supply caches in locations that systematic searching was unlikely to discover. The same intelligence gathering that had made her valuable as a domestic servant now provided crucial advantages in evading capture. The first week of the manhunt produced false leads, mistaken identities, and growing frustration among the search teams who discovered that tracking a single person through the harsh desert terrain was far more difficult than suppressing organized Apache raids. The vast distances involved, combined with the fugitive's obvious familiarity with the local geography, created logistical challenges that strained territorial resources to their limits. The psychological impact of Esther's continued freedom began to affect the enslaved population throughout the territory as word of Isabella's murder spread through the informal communication networks that connected mining camps, plantations, and domestic installations across the Southwest. The story grew in the telling, transformed from simple violence into a symbol of resistance that inspired both hope and terror, depending on which side of the racial divide the listeners occupied. Reports began reaching Captain Strangled of suspicious incidents at other mining operations, tools disappearing from equipment sheds, guard dogs poisoned during the night, and small fires that destroyed property without threatening human life. Whether these incidents represented Esther's continued activities or copycat actions inspired by her example became irrelevant, as their cumulative effect created a climate of fear among the territorial elite. The discovery of Esther's first message occurred on September 15th, exactly 1 week after Isabella's murder, when workers at the Thornfield silver mine found a piece of cloth tied to the main gate with words written in charcoal that sent shockwaves through the territorial government. Isabella Vrenneth died because she forgot that we are human. Remember that when you decide how to treat your property. The message was signed simply E and marked the beginning of a psychological campaign that would prove more effective than any physical resistance. The last confirmed sighting of Esther occurred on October 31, 1852, when a woman matching her description appeared at the Apache trading post near Dragoon Springs, 60 miles southeast of Copperton Valley. The trader, a mixed-blood Cherokee named Jonas Thalvin, later reported that she had exchanged silver coins for supplies and ammunition before disappearing into the Chiricahua Mountains, with the kind of confidence that suggested intimate familiarity with the harsh terrain. Thalvin's account, dismissed by territorial authorities as unreliable due to his racial background and suspected sympathies for fugitive slaves, described a woman who had undergone a complete transformation from the domestic servant depicted in wanted posters. She moved with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to navigate desert country, spoke with the quiet authority of a person accustomed to making life-and-death decisions, and carried herself with a dignity that 3 years of systematic degradation had failed to destroy. More significantly, Thalvin reported that she had paid for her supplies with silver coins that bore the distinctive markings of the Droswin mining operation, suggesting that her escape had involved more than simple flight. The implications of this detail sent additional search parties into the mountains and prompted a comprehensive audit of mining company assets that revealed systematic theft spanning several months before Isabella's murder. The audit uncovered evidence of a sophisticated intelligence operation that had been gathering information about illegal labor practices, safety violations, and corrupt arrangements with territorial officials throughout the spring and summer of 1852. Documents were missing from company files, correspondence had been copied, and financial records showed unexplained discrepancies that suggested someone with intimate knowledge of the operation had been systematically documenting crimes that could destroy the entire territorial power structure. Captain Stravin's investigation revealed that Esther had been far more than a domestic servant who had snapped under pressure. She had been conducting what amounted to a one-person intelligence operation, gathering evidence that could have brought down not only the Drosswin Empire, but also the network of corrupt officials who enabled it. Her murder of Isabella represented not random violence but the opening move in a carefully planned campaign against the entire system of territorial bondage. The psychological impact of this revelation transformed the manhunt from a simple pursuit into an existential crisis for the territorial elite. If one enslaved woman could conduct such an operation undetected for months, how many others possessed similar capabilities? How much evidence of their crimes had been gathered? Most terrifying of all, how many people throughout the territory might be inspired to follow Esther's example? The winter of 1852 to 1853 brought reports of incidents that confirmed these fears. Mining operations throughout the territory experienced equipment failures, supply thefts, and communication disruptions that followed patterns similar to those documented during Esther's final months at the Drosswin mansion. Whether these incidents represented coordinated resistance or isolated actions inspired by her legend became irrelevant as their cumulative effect created a climate of fear among mine owners and territorial officials. The territorial government's response revealed both the extent of their panic and the fundamental weaknesses in their system of control. New laws required domestic workers to wear identification badges, prohibited gatherings of more than 3 enslaved people without white supervision, and mandated harsh punishments for anyone found in possession of materials that could be used for written communication. These measures, intended to prevent future intelligence operations, instead advertised the authorities' fear while making daily life more difficult for everyone involved. The economic impact of the security measures proved almost as destructive as the resistance activities they were designed to prevent. The cost of additional guards, tracking dogs, and surveillance equipment strained mining company budgets while reducing productivity through constant security protocols. Insurance companies began charging premium rates for properties that employed enslaved workers, understanding that the Esther incident had fundamentally altered the risk calculations for such operations. More importantly, the story of Esther's rebellion began to spread through the informal communication networks that connected enslaved communities across the Southwest. The details grew in the telling, transformed from historical fact into inspirational legend that emphasized themes of intelligence, planning, and ultimate triumph over seemingly impossible odds. Children born into bondage after 1852 grew up hearing whispered stories about the woman who had proven that resistance was possible. The oral tradition that preserved Esther's story served multiple functions beyond simple inspiration. The tales contained practical information about escape routes, survival techniques, and the weaknesses of security systems disguised as entertainment for those smart enough to decode the messages. Guard rotation schedules became verses in work songs, while supply routes were preserved in children's games that appeared innocent to casual observation. The territorial legislature's attempts to suppress these stories through increasingly harsh penalties only served to spread them more widely, as each new law advertised the authorities' fear while providing additional material for the storytellers who kept Esther's legend alive. The more desperate the government became in its efforts to erase her memory, the more powerful her symbolic presence became in the communities that had suffered under territorial oppression. The most significant long-term impact of Esther's rebellion was psychological rather than political, fundamentally altering how both enslaved people and their masters understood the nature of power relationships in the American Southwest. The comfortable fiction that bondage represented the natural order of things had been shattered by a shoelace in Louisiana and finished off by a pearl necklace in Arizona Territory. The enslaved population had learned that resistance was possible, while their masters had discovered that absolute control was an illusion. Federal investigators arrived in Arizona Territory during the spring of 1853, prompted by reports of the deteriorating security situation and concerns about the territory's readiness for eventual statehood. Their findings, preserved in National Archives documents that remained classified until the 1960s, revealed a system of labor relations so brutal and corrupt that federal intervention became inevitable. The investigators specifically cited the Esther incident as evidence that territorial authorities had lost control of the situation. The investigators' report recommended immediate federal oversight of mining operations, mandatory safety inspections, and the gradual elimination of enslaved labor in favor of wage workers who would have legal recourse against abusive employers. While these recommendations were not fully implemented until after the Civil War, they marked the beginning of the end for the system that had killed Isabella Vrenneth and created the conditions that transformed Esther into a legend. The Civil War brought changes that fulfilled many of the implications of Esther's rebellion. Enslaved workers throughout the territory were officially freed by federal decree, while many of the mine owners and territorial officials who had participated in the manhunt found themselves facing federal prosecution for war crimes and violations of constitutional rights. The system that had seemed so permanent in 1852 proved to be as fragile as Isabella's pearl necklace when confronted with determined resistance. Veterans of the Union Army who served in Arizona Territory during and after the war reported encounters with an elderly Apache woman who spoke perfect English and demonstrated detailed knowledge of mining operations throughout the region. Her description matched Esther's general appearance, aged by 15 years of desert living, but official records dismissed these accounts as confused encounters with mixed-blood traders or Apache captives who had learned English during their captivity. The stories persisted despite official skepticism, growing into a legend that Apache oral tradition preserved alongside their own resistance narratives. According to these accounts, the woman known as Pearl Walker served as an advisor to Apache leaders during their conflicts with mining companies and territorial militias, providing intelligence about enemy operations while training Apache fighters in techniques for sabotaging industrial equipment. Modern historians studying territorial records have identified patterns in Apache resistance activities during the 1860s and 1870s that suggest coordination with someone possessing intimate knowledge of mining operations and security procedures. The precision of these attacks, combined with their systematic targeting of specific companies and officials, indicates planning capabilities that exceeded traditional Apache warfare methods while remaining consistent with the intelligence operation that Esther had conducted during her years at the Droswin mansion. The final chapter of Esther's story may never be written, as the line between historical fact and inspirational legend became blurred long before modern historians began their investigations. What remains clear is that her transformation from victim to symbol fundamentally altered the trajectory of territorial development, while inspiring resistance movements that outlasted the system they opposed. Today, visitors to the remains of Copperton Valley can still see foundations from the Droswin mansion, now protected as a historical site that commemorates both the brutality of territorial labor practices and the courage of those who resisted them. A small memorial plaque, installed in 1992, bears a simple inscription: "In memory of Esther and all those who refused to accept that human beings could be property." The plaque makes no mention of Isabella Vrenneth, whose death has been forgotten by everyone except historians studying the darker chapters of American territorial expansion. But on desert nights, when the wind carries voices through the ruins of the mining operations, locals still report hearing sounds that might be equipment settling or might be something else entirely. A reminder that some stories refuse to stay buried no matter how much time passes. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.